Well, hello 3C. We're going to talk about finding zeros today. So our goal is I can find the zeros of a quadratic equation in both factored form and vertex form. So we're talking about zeros, and we're going to first talk about exactly what a zero is. So if I use I'm going to use my little shape recognition tool and draw me a parabola there. There's a nice parabola, a little bit skinny maybe, but what do I mean by the x-intercepts of this, or by the zeros of this parabola? I actually just gave you the clue there. It's actually the x-intercepts. Now the reason they're called zeros is if we take a look at the x-intercepts, and right here where they cross the x-axis, this is the x-axis, this is the y, we're interested where they cross this x-axis. If I look at this, I don't actually know what the x value is. I know it's somewhere over here in the negative x spot, but I don't know what it is, so I'm just going to call that x1. Now, wherever that x1 is, I do know what the y is. Since the y is how far up or down from the x-axis it is, since it's right on the x-axis, the y is 0. Now over here, same thing goes here. I don't know what the x is. We're going to call that x2. Since it's a different x than that one, we can't use the same x. But I do know that the y at that point is going to be 0. And this is why they're called the zeros. This is where y is 0. So the zeros and the x-intercepts are exactly the same thing. So when any equation crosses the x-axis, the value of y at that point is 0. That's why we call it a zero. So most parabolas have two zeros. Some will have only one, so we get two zeros. Some will have one, and still others will have no zeros at all. So what will these parabolas look like that have these things? Well, two parabolas, two zeros, it crosses the x-axis in some way, shape, or form. It could be right side up, it could be upside down, it could be over here somewhere. It crosses the x-axis. One zero means that it has to just touch that x-axis, and the only way it can just touch is if that vertex point is right on the x-axis. Now it could be upside down as well, but it just touches. And then to have no zeros at all, that means that it opens up and is above, or it opens down and is below. Okay, so these are the three different things. Here's where we have 2, here's where we have 1, and here's where we have none. Now, how do we figure out where these are? We're going to start with the easy one first. We're going to start in factored form. So in factored form, we want to know where the y is equal to 0. So let's sub a 0 in here. X plus 3, x minus 2. Now I want to know when this is going to be 0. Now we actually learned back when we were talking about the factored form that these two numbers in here give us the value of the x-intercepts. But why? Why do these give us the value of the x-intercepts? Now here's the reason. It's because we want that y to be 0. I'm going to make this a little bit simpler. Just over here I'm going to say if I have something times something else, let's say an a and a b, and I know that they equal 0. I know that either a or b has to be equal to 0. That's the only way you can multiply to 0 is if one of those things are 0. Well, the same thing here. I've got this bracket multiplied with this bracket. Now, if one of these things is 0, then the whole thing is 0. So I have to figure out what's going to turn each of these brackets 0. So let's think about the value I'm going to stick in for x that's going to cancel out a positive 3. Hopefully you realize that that's a negative 3. And that's why we have to change the sign in there. Not because we just want to change the sign, but because I want to cancel out the term that's already in there. So I've got that negative 3. Now this one, I want to cancel that term out. How do I cancel out a negative 2? You cancel out negatives with positives, so I need a positive 2. And that's why we want the signs changed so that we can cancel them out. So let's have a look at a few examples here. This says find all the zeros for the given equations. So remember, we're just canceling out what's already in the brackets. Here, I've got a positive 4 in the bracket. What do I have to stick in for x? Well, that's going to be a negative 4. And the second bracket, I've got a negative 6. To cancel that out, I need a positive 6. Part B, we've got two brackets, but we've also got this -2 out front. So I'm just going to pull this little note out here and see what it tells me. And the note says the A value has no influence on what the zeros will be. So that actually means I can just ignore this -2 out front. It doesn't matter if it's -2 or -2 million. It is not going to have any effect on what makes these brackets 0. All we have to do is take a look and see how I can cancel out what's in there. How do I cancel out a -2 by sticking in an X? I got to put in a +2. How do I cancel out a +4 by sticking in something for X? Gotta be -4. Now the next one's a little bit rough because I've got no brackets. And if I got no brackets, I got nothing that I can make 0. However, we learned a while ago that we have to actually factor it, and we know how to factor it, so I'm going to start this way. I'm going to pull out this coefficient from all of the terms. So I'm going to take out a 5, and what I have to do is I divide each of these things by 5. I'm going to divide them all by 5. And so what I'm left with is an x squared plus a 7x plus a 12. Now remember, when we were learning about factoring, I have to look at this sign first. That sign tells me that the brackets have the same signs. So I know I've got x and x to give me that x squared at the front. And I know I either have two negatives or two positives. That's how I get a positive on here. And to tell which one it is, I have to look at this sign, and that tells me they're both positives. So that's why I'm going to put the two positives in there. Now we have to read it backwards. We're looking for two things that multiply to 12 and add to 7. So what multiplies to 12? There's 1 and 12, 2 and 6, or 3 and 4. Those are the only things that multiply to 12, and the ones that add to 7 are 3 and 4. And it doesn't matter which order I put them in, because they're both positive, so it doesn't matter. So now I just have to figure out, what do I put in to make those brackets 0? Well, that's going to be a -3 in there and a -4 in there. Now, what does this say out here? Note, if it isn't factored, you will need to go through the factoring process. One up on that note there, we've already done it. Okay, so have a look here. In vertex form. Now vertex form, we don't have two sets of brackets. I've got that plus k on the end, which means this is going to be a little bit harder. So I'm going to go through these steps to showing you how to find the 0 here. So we're going to go through steps 1 through, looky here, there's 5 of them. So let's take a look. Step number 1 says set y equal to 0. That's easy enough. I'm going to take that y, and where I see a y, I'm going to put a 0. Now we have to go about solving for x. So here's how we go about solving for x. We got to get rid of this thing first. That's the first thing we're going to get rid of, and I think that's probably what step 2 is going to tell me. It's going to tell me to add or subtract the constant term, or the k value is what's on the end, to get it to the other side. So in this case, it's a -8, so to get rid of it, we have to add it. And remember, whatever you do to one side of an equation, you do the same thing to the other. So we're going to add that to both sides. So this side becomes 8, and this side is 2x plus 3 squared. Now the next thing we're going to get rid of is that 2. Now that 2 is multiplying x plus 3 squared. So what I have to do to get rid of it is I have to divide by 2, and that'll cancel that out. But remember, whatever you do to one side, you do the same thing to the other. So I got to divide by 2 on that side, which means that on this side I have 4, and on this side I'm left with that x plus 3 squared. And I think what we just did there is what 3 is going to say. Divide both sides by the a value. That's what I did with the 2. Let's take a look at what 4 tells us. 4 tells us the next thing we have to get rid of is the square by taking the square root of both sides. So I got to get rid of that square. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. When I take the square root of this side, and I'm going to take the square root of that side. So here's what I get when I take the square root of this side. I'm just going to get what's under the brackets. I got to get rid of that squared. And when I take the square root of 4, well, you can pull up a calculator if you want. The square root of 4 is 2. However, I want you to remember that anytime you take the square root, there's actually two answers. Your calculator only gives you one, but there's actually two. There's positive 2, but there's also negative 2, because negative 2 times negative 2 also gives us positive 4. So there's our two answers. And then our last step, we're going to have to do twice, one with each of the answers from the previous step. I got to get rid of this positive 3. And to get rid of the positive 3, I have to subtract 3. So I'm going to subtract 3 on both sides. However, this is going to split into two different things here. I've got two different x values. X is going to equal negative 2 minus 3, or x is going to equal this positive 2 minus 3, because we had that negative 2 and the positive 2 from the previous step. So our answers are going to be either negative 5 or negative 1. And there are our two values for where it crosses the x-axis. Now, what did it say in step number 5? Let's pull that over. It says add or subtract the h value to both square roots to get your two zeros. And there are our two zeros. Now, there's two more examples to go through here. I would suggest that you put me on pause and do it yourself, but I'm just going to blow right through them very quickly here. And I'm going to start by putting 0 in where y is. I'm following those 5 steps. The first step said put 0 in where y is. X minus 3 squared plus 45. The first thing I've got to get rid of is this thing floating around on the end here. So I'm going to do that by subtracting 45. But if I subtract 45 on that side, I also have to subtract 45 on that side. So this side becomes negative 45. And the other side is negative 5 bracket x minus 3 all squared. Now if I take a look, the next thing I have to get rid of is that negative 5. And to get rid of that negative 5, which is multiplying that bracket, I do the opposite. I divide. So I divide both sides by negative 5. And then on this side, it becomes just x minus 3 all squared. And on this side, negative 45 divided by negative 5 is positive 9. The next thing, I got to get rid of the squared. That's the thing that's bothering me. So whoa, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. So to get rid of this squared here, we have to do the opposite. The opposite of squaring is taking the square root. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. When I take the square root of both sides, it just goes away on this side and I'm left with x minus 3. And the square root of 9 is 3, but remember there's also the negative version, because negative 3 times negative 3 is also positive 9, and 3 times 3 is positive 9. So therefore the square root of 9 is actually two answers, positive 3 and negative 3. So we got to take both of those into consideration. And the last thing I want to do is get this negative 3, get rid of that thing. And I'm going to get rid of that thing by adding 3 to both sides. So I'm going to add 3. And remember, I got to do it to each one of these over here, because this kind of splits into two answers. And so the two answers I'm going to get here are 0, because negative 3 plus 3 is 0. And 3 plus 3 is 6. So there are my two x-intercepts. If I were to graph this parabola, or just a really rough sketch of the parabola, it's going to cross at 0 and 6. And I know it's upside down because of this negative out here. So this is a really rough sketch at 0 and this one here at 6. Now this last one's actually a bit of an easy one because we're missing some stuff here. And so we're going to start like any others. We're going to put a 0 in where the y is. And then I've got negative 2x plus 6 all squared. Now there's nothing to take away on the end, so we just ignore that part. And we go to the next step, which says I have to get rid of that negative 2. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 2. But 0 divided by negative 2 is simply 0. So this just means 0, x plus 6 all squared. Now the next step is to take the square root of both sides, but the square root of 0 is actually just 0. 0 times 0 is 0. And talking about positive and negative 0 makes no sense at all. 0 is just itself. So this side is just x plus 6. I just take that 2 off of there. And this is going to be one of the cases where this parabola just touches the axes. And if I'm going to find where it just touches the axes, I'm going to subtract 6 off of both sides, and it's going to just touch the axes at negative 6. equals x. So this is one of the cases where it has only one x-intercept, and that x-intercept is going to be at -6. Now I'm going to do a quick sketch here. We've got negative, so it's upside down. So it's going to look like this. It's just going to touch here at -6, and it's going to open down. It's going to be a little bit skinny because it's got a 2 there. Okay, so this is just a rough sketch. And that's it for this video.